Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in Spanish and French literature. In some ways today, we are moving way back to the origins, the very, very origins of the Foxed Page. So really, these lectures, this podcast, began as a lecture series that I was giving at a local bookstore here in Northern California. The book that I wanted to kick us off with was, in fact, The Anthologist by Nicholson Baker. I have always been a huge Nicholson Baker fan, and The Anthologist just kind of lit this fire in me. At the time, this was like, 2014 or something like that. At the time, we couldn't get enough copies of the book. And because I have been reading so many amazing things recently by Nicholson Baker, I have decided it is time to go back and to check out The Anthologist. It is now out in this very cool edition where we have The Anthologist together with Traveling Sprinkler. Those of you who are not on the YouTube and who don't own this volume, the volume is called The Paul Chowder Chronicles, and it's one of those very cool things where one of the books you read through, and then if you flip the book upside down, like a crazy magic trick, then you have the second book in the volume. So both of these obviously have to do with a narrator called Paul Chowder, but we are only going to discuss The Anthologist because honestly, I realized when I was pulling the lecture together today that if we were able to parse and analyze and really dive into all of the aspects that I want to discuss, we would literally be here for like 8 hours. Those of you watching on YouTube have noticed, in fact, maybe, that I am sitting in what looks kind of like a dead-end cave kind of a thing. I am, in fact, coming to you from the powder room. The reason why I am sitting in a bathroom is because, in fact, this amazing wallpaper here that I got from Anthropology is in fact in iambic pentameter. It is in fact from Midsummer Night's Dream by Shakespeare. I also really love it because they have pulled out and emphasized the words puck and fairy. And when you say puck and fairy, lots of times together, it ends up sounding like fuck and Perry. In fact, I'm going to show you this beautiful wallpaper. It's actually stitched. It's like this incredible font that Anthropology, who knows where this stuff was made, but it's this beautiful font that is stitched into the wallpaper. And in fact, we have Shakespeare all around us in here. It seemed only fitting because Paul Chowder is an anthologist of poetry to situate myself somewhere where I was surrounded, in fact, by iambic pentameter. As always, I like to begin the lecture with this idea of why should we be talking about this book? Partially, it is because The Anthologist is unique. Nicholson Baker is so idiosyncratic and unique and inventive in his prose that I really love the idea of sharing with you a novel that I think really is unlike any other novel. A lot of listeners and members of the Foxed Page community like the fact that often what I will suggest that people read, it tends to be books that they would not have found on their own. And certainly that has been the case with Nicholson Baker. Recently, we've looked at The Mezzanine, we've looked at Finding a Likeness, and those are certainly books that people might not have stumbled across on their own. And it makes me very happy to be sharing Nicholson Baker with anyone who might not already know about his genius. I also am so happy to share all of the warmth and all of the humor in this book. Paul Chowder, as a narrator, is incredibly self-deprecating, but he's also incredibly warm and forthcoming and vulnerable and so funny. So I really, I like the idea, just recently we were looking at Joan Didion's Democracy. That was not an uplifting kind of book. Here, I can feel like I am, passing on to you this kind of unalloyed experience of warmth and humor, which, who doesn't want to immerse themselves in a little warmth and humor right about now? I also like the idea of thinking of poetry. So I am not a huge poetry lover. I wish I were. I feel like it's kind of like some sort of personal failing. But in this book, Nicholson Baker talks about how everyone has certain periods of time when they're thinking a lot about poetry. Often it's in high school when they make you do a poetry unit, or even before that, maybe in elementary school. For me, there were a few times in high school, certainly again in college. And then, even as a graduate student, I had to really subsume myself in some poetry from time to time. And I tell you, I appreciated it. I love the idea that poetry is sort of literature at its very most sort of intense, just given that every single word is load bearing and every single word matters and every single syllable is chosen with care and is resonant and is beautiful and important. But it is not something that I find myself wanting to like tote around in my bag with me. So I had this sense of really wanting, in fact, to immerse myself again and to think again about poetry. Nicholson Baker really makes you want, in fact, to go ahead and listen to some poetry or to pick up an anthology. Although I have to say that every time I read The Anthologist, I think I'm going to do that. I'm going to like go on some big poetry jag, and as yet, it has not happened. I also really wanted to dig in today. It seems like such miraculous prose to me in so many ways that I love the idea of being able to sort of pick apart what it is he is doing, both to really just sort of revel in it, but also to understand better what makes this prose tick. Okay, those of you who like an agenda, we're first going to talk very briefly about Nicholson Baker's biography. We're going to dive in, look at the title, the cover, and the opening pages of The Anthologist. We are then going to talk about essentially the thesis of the anthology that this anthologist, Paul Chowder, is trying to pull together. We are then going to look at the structure and the tension for a book that is a lot about sort of minutia and about musings and about poetry and about art. There actually is some pretty tangible tension, and it is built with this structure that Nicholson Baker uses, which is very subtle, but I find it so effective and sort of sweet in some ways. So we'll look at that. We are going to look at the idiosyncratic nature of the prose and the inventiveness of the prose. We're going to look at humor. We're going to look at cadence, the kind of spoken feel in the prose, which is so important. We're going to talk about figurative language and some mindfulness. We're going to talk about the way that Nicholson Baker is asking us to really be in the moment and to really focus on the now and what is happening around us. And then we will close. In terms of biography, Nicholson Baker was born in 1957 in New York, New York. We know from the book Finding a Likeness, which is a nonfiction book that he wrote recently. There's a Fox Page lecture that you can watch about that. Both of his parents were artists. He did not grow up in New York City. I think he grew up upstate. He went to the Eastman School of Music, had some musical training, certainly has a musical bent. And you see that in our narrator, in Paul Chowder. There's lots of Paul Chowder, setting poems to music. And there are, in fact, lots of times where we have the transcription of music. Occasionally, I would try to sing along, but I am not someone who reads music very fluently. But again, this is someone who is clearly very versed, no pun intended, in music, and you can see that musicality, present in the prose itself. He then ended up graduating from Haverford College. He married a woman named Margaret. I think they were relatively young when they got married, had 2 kids. He won the National Book Critics Circle Award, and that was for a book called Double Fold. So Nicholson Baker has lots of inventive fiction that he writes, but also these really brainy, really deft and very sort of comprehensive looks at things like libraries and things like the Second World War. I mean, those are kind of different libraries in the Second World War, but he has these very ambitious, big tomes that I have to say I have not, in fact, read. I am so enamored of the fiction that I just keep coming back to that. He did, in 2018, win a Guggenheim, which was so funny to me because in the Paul Chowder Chronicles, Paul Chowder talks about having won a Guggenheim and the importance of it, but what I loved is that he kept referring to it as the Goog, having won the Goog. So in fact, our Nicholson Baker also was a recipient of a Goog at one point. He lives in Maine. So we're going to take a very quick look at the cover art. So I couldn't find my hard copy version. I don't know where it went. I actually like it a bit better. It's a different illustration of a plum. And in fact, it's not watercolor. It's like a more sort of like a botanical study sort of a thing. It is so appealing. It's a plum on a cream colored ground. And it simply says, the anthologist, Nicholson Baker. This is a bit different. We still have the plum, which I was very happy about. But in fact, here, the Paul Chowder Chronicles is really taken up a lot more space. I love the fact that Nicholson Baker is sort of first and foremost up at the top of the volume. Really, Nicholson Baker is enough of a name now that you know what you are buying is Nicholson Baker and this incredible prose that he promises, more so than you're buying, I think, any one title. I like the idea of the plum on the front, in part because of the idea of things like, plumbing the depths, first of all, but also the sort of less idiomatic things about like a plum job. He refers it sometimes to writing plums or coming up with a plum. So I think that must be like, if you're part of a poetic community, that a plum is like, some sort of really like well done poem. But there is also this idea of juiciness. So he talks a lot about juicy words in this anthology, and also, in fact, in Finding a Likeness. Now that I have read Finding a Likeness and know that he has always been interested in art, it makes me appreciate even more this really beautiful and thoughtful selection of these plums that are sort of on the cover of each of the editions that I have. I also like the idea of kind of like a still life moment, and the idea of fruit and a plum as being something that is, alive now but is perishable, of something that you would want to capture. I mean, still life, kind of the point of the still life is that in fact everything is going to rot and decay, and that we're catching it at a moment, but in fact mortality is deeply embedded in a still life. So I like the idea of these ripe, beautiful, perfect plums as also standing in for this idea of mortality and decay and loss, which on some level the anthologist is a lot about time and legacy and endurance, and it's a real study in some ways of immortality and mortality, given the presence of these different poets who have become somewhat immortal given their own poetical output. So that's the cover art. I love the title. So partially because it's really focusing our attention on sort of all the right things in my mind. Is Paul Chowder an anthologist? If so, that's a real come down, because what he really wants to be is like a Guggenheim winning, a poet of some renown who's going to remain immortal. And in fact, he is being sort of demoted to the level of anthologist. I like the idea of the anthologist as kind of a stand-in to, it's sort of like the poet. And there are lots and lots of poets who are coming, into play in this volume, literally coming to life in ways that I found so inventive and incredible. But we have this idea of the anthologist. It's not Paul Chowder anthologist, it is the anthologist. Of course, there is the tension that is palpable throughout the entire novel, this question of like, is he actually going to be an anthologist? There are real money woes. There's all sorts of tension about whether or not he's going to actually be able to write this introduction, which is the last piece of the anthology that needs to come in. And so there are real questions about him as an anthologist. Okay, now we're going to move on to the opening of the novel. Right here at the very beginning of the book, we have this on page 1. Hello, this is Paul Chowder, and I'm going to try to tell you everything I know. Well, not everything I know, because a lot of what I know, you know, but everything I know about poetry. All my tips and tricks and woes and worries are going to come tumbling out before you. I'm going to divulge them. What a juicy word that is, divulge. Truth opening its petals. Truth smells like Chinese food and sweat. What is poetry? Poetry is prose in slow motion. Now, that isn't true of rhymed poets. It's not true of Sir Walter Scott. It's not true of Longfellow or Tennyson or Swinburne or Yeats. Rhymed poems are different. But the kind of free verse poems that most poets write now, the kind that I write, is slow motion prose. My life is a lie. My career is a joke. I'm a study in failure. Obviously, I'm up in the barn again, which sounds like a country song, except for the word obviously. In some ways, when I went back and reread the very beginning of this novel, I was like, oh, shoot, I am not sure that the very beginning of the novel is like quite as powerful as what comes after. And I will stand by the idea that some of the strongest work is not maybe on the first page, but it's also doing some very important work. So One of the things that we are introduced to right away is this question of Paul Chowder as, in fact, giving us this narration. It's a first person narration, and right away there is direct address with the reader. So it's I, Paul Chowder, I'm talking to you, a reader. And again, there's this very clear sense of an I and a you, which is it's very intimate in lots of ways. And so it's setting up this idea of this very sort of confessional and this very sort of intimate one-on-one conversation that we are going to have. There's this idea at the very beginning too of sort of unexpected premises. This idea of like, I'm going to tell you everything I know. And then he says, well, not everything. And you don't know exactly quite where he's going. And he says, because a lot of what I know, you also know, which was surprising to me. Like there are lots of things you could say, because a lot of what I know, you don't need to know, or a lot of what I know is not pertinent here. But in fact, which is the same thing, actually. But this idea of like, you already know a lot of the stuff that I know is actually one of the main themes that sort of runs through this. There's lots of talk here about rap, about trance music, about, he mentions Ludacris at one point. He mentions, I can't even remember the other rappers, but he's talking a lot about contemporary music. This book came out in 2009, so it would have been contemporary to that era. But there's a lot of stuff about baby talk or about rhyming or nursery rhymes. So this idea of we as the reader already know a lot of what he already knows is also this really nice way to create intimacy and to sort of boost the reader. Like, yes, it's going to be about poetry, but in fact, you already know a lot about poetry. And that does end up being a very important part of his argument about rhyme, because one of his contentions is that the way that we learn to speak is through rhyme. We're very rhyme dependent, and that, English, in fact, wants to rhyme. Language wants to rhyme in many ways. And so that rhyming is, in fact, very central and very sort of foundational to the way that we use language as a whole. We also have this idea of humor right from the start here. We're going to talk more about humor later. But this idea toward the end of, I'm up in the barn, obviously, which that's kind of a nice thing there, because it's the sense of like, it's not obvious to us that we're up in the barn, but that presupposes some intimacy. It presupposes that we have a little familiarity with him. I mean, it also presupposes perhaps a little self-importance that he thinks we already know that. But this use of obviously, and then saying that sounds like a country song, except for the word obviously, is pointing us in the direction that none of this is going to be taken too seriously. We're going to have lots of digressions. They're going to be somewhat humorous. So all of that is, in fact, included in the beginning. I will say, again, not like the very, very strongest opening of any Nicholson Baker book that I have read, but one that does, in fact, introduce us to things that will become important. We're going to dive right into this idea of what the sort of main thrust, kind of what the thesis of the anthology is going to be. And, I'll say right at the top here that every time we are looking at this prose, whether it's to look at his thesis or his use of figurative language or structure or whatever the thing is, it's also such a great excuse to dive into some of this unique and just, I think, often hilarious and very warm and very self-deprecating prose. So on page 3, we have him saying this. My theory, I can't resist giving you a little glimpse of it here. My theory is that iambic pentameter is in actuality a waltz. It's not 5-beat rhythm, even though pent means 5, because 5 beats would be totally off kilter and ridiculous and would never work and would be a complete disaster and totally unlistenable. So what I love here is some of the hyperbole and also just the plainness with which he is speaking and kind of like the urgency and like the desperation in it. The idea that it would be totally off kilter and ridiculous, would never work, would be a complete disaster and totally unlistenable. I mean, he's repeating totally twice there. Totally is one of those adverbs that's, it's a very spoken kind of phrase. It feels very colloquial. It feels very now. It feels very casual. But also you can hear like his indignation about iambic pentameter. So again, I will remind you that all around me on my stitched wallpaper is, Shakespearean iambic pentameter. And so part of you is like, wait a second, is he really truly going to push up against all of, like Elizabethan poetry and like one of the greatest writers of all time? And in fact, he is in some ways doing that, but also what he's arguing, it's not like that he wants to throw iambic pentameter out and that he thinks Shakespeare's terrible. What he's doing here is saying, in fact, that it's a 6-beat thing, that there's a rest at the end and you have to have this rest. So that concept is going to get fleshed out a bit more. But I love the fact that on page 3, he on some level, this anthology, I mean, it's very important to him on lots of levels, but he's explaining that importance right from the start. This thing, my theory, I can't resist giving you a little glimpse of it here. My theory is that iambic pentameter is actually a waltz. So you have this idea of this theory that he really, like this burning concept that he in fact needs to convey. And that does give us some urgency and certainly a through line throughout the book. Okay, then this idea of iambic pentameter, we're going to jump all the way to 181. So that's getting pretty close to the end. I think this volume's like 210 pages, something like that. So again, we're jumping all the way to 181. At this point, again, we're toward the end of the book, and he's sort of concluding his argument about iambic pentameter here. And he's doing that with the help of James Fenton, who is this poet who is a little out of style, out of fashion, but in fact that Nicholson Baker, that Paul Chowder really, really respects and loves. So on page 181, he's talking about James Fenton's take on iambic pentameter. First, he says that iambic pentameter is preeminent in English poetry. No, it is not. No, it is not. Iambic pentameter is an import that Geoffrey Chaucer brought in from French verse, and it was unstable from the very beginning. No, the march, the work song, the love lyric, the ballad, the sea shanty, the nursery rhyme, the limerick, those are the preeminent forms, and all of them have 4 beats to them. So this is so interesting because this is like some heavy duty analysis here. I mean, he's talking about, like who's borrowing which rhyme scheme from which, old language, whether Old English, Old French, all of these different things. What I love is he's not belaboring them. And it doesn't even really matter if he's 100% correct and whether or not we have enough information, to buy into his theory. None of that is really relevant, because his passion is so palpable and, the arguments are good enough for me. And he is, in fact, bolstering them with a lot of really excellent information. So just a few pages after this kind of urgent idea that Fenton is, in fact, wrong about this one concept, I mean, that repetition of like, no, it is not, no, it is not. It's interesting because it's not even a contraction. He's not saying, no, it's not. It's like the urgency of it is even seen in the syntax of what Paul Chowder is quoted as saying there. But so just a few pages later, in fact, he is really pushing this theory about iambic pentameter needing its rests and how it is in triplets and in 6, sort of 6-beat chunks. He says this: you've got to have the rests. There's no question about it. If you don't have the rests, you don't have a proper couplet. These are 6-beat lines. So-called iambic pentameter is in its deepest essence a 6-beat line. Actually, no. I take that back. It's not. In its very deepest, darkest essence, it is a 3-beat line. I love deepest, darkest essence, the darkest essence of iambic pentameter. Then across the way, he says, you can leap around the room reciting so-called iambic pentameter to yourself, and your leaps will fall in 3s. You cannot make your leaps fall into 5s. You need to add the rest. I'm telling you, this is true. So we have this idea here of Paul Chowder actually leaping around. So you have this kind of ridiculous but very impassioned defense of the fact that iambic pentameter is great, but in fact it is not 5 beats. In addition to this kind of new theory about iambic pentameter, he also has this real emphasis on rhyme and this idea that, rhyme is very important and it has kind of fallen out of fashion, and in fact that we should bring it back. So he has this manuscript of the anthology, and we get this glimpse of it on page 39. I have a long table on the 2nd floor with the manuscript of Only Rhyme on it. Jean has sent me the cover art. The catalog copy is already written, already published. It says, Paul Chowder's introduction locates rhyming poetry in its historical context and reawakens our sense of the fructifying limitlessness of traditional forms. No, it doesn't. Fruck. It doesn't do anything because it doesn't exist. So I love this, the idea that like the anthology is due to come out. In fact, there's already, this kind of press material about it. And the idea of fructifying, which is sort of like, it's going to, I mean, do I even know what fructifying means? I think it means like both edifying, but also like I have a feeling that it has to do with like fecundity. Like that might even be wrong. If you're watching the YouTube channel, I will in fact put the definition of fructifying on the screen here for you. But I love the idea of the fructifying limitlessness of traditional forms. I mean, we can tell from context that it means sort of the fertile nature of these forms. But then when he says fruck afterward, it's this kind of that's that kind of like humor that's kind of like it's kind of sweet in some ways, but it's unexpected and intellectual and just kind of amusing and just kind of delightful in all of these different ways. Okay, then on pages 64 and 65, he's getting a little further into his argument about why rhyme is important. Now, of course, I think tulips rhyme. One tulip leaf goes this way, and the other tulip leaf goes that way. Their forms talk to each other. There's symmetry. There's a central stalk, and there's mirroring. Most definitely the tulip rhymes. Nature is full of rhymes. And then across the way, much of this discussion of rhyming is coming when he is young. At this point, toward the beginning of the book, he's talking about being a fourth grader whose teacher has just told them that nothing has to rhyme, that everything can be in free verse. And in fact, she invites them to write a poem that does not have any rhyme to it. And even, as a fourth grader, whose mother read a lot of poetry to him that was rhyming poetry when he was young, he has this suspicion, but then he shares, in fact, his experience. Where does little Miss Muffet sit? Did she sit on a cushion? Did she sit on a love seat? No, she sat on a tuffet. And if it doesn't rhyme, it's just guano. Guano was one of my favorite words back then. I'd learned it from Tintin. But I said nothing, like the craven fourth grader that I was. And then at what is, more or less the midpoint of the book, he digs in a little bit deeper into this idea of the importance of rhyme and how kind of basic and how sort of foundational rhyme is in all language and in language learning when we are young. So he has this on page 94. Baby talk, which is full of rhyme, is really the way you learn to figure out what's like and what's not like, and what is a discrete word or an utterance, and what is just a transition between two words. How does it happen? Well, it happens gradually, and it happens by matching. Then across the way. You're a newborn brain. You've only recently come out of solitary confinement in the uterus, and you're already a cryptoanalysis in Bletchley Park. You're already parsing through, looking for similarities and differences, looking for patterns, looking for beginnings and endings and hints of meaning. Especially beginnings. And then the following page. So what rhyming poems do is they take all these nearby sound curves and remind you that they first existed that way in your brain. Before they meant something specific, they had a shape and a way of being said. And now, yes, gloom and broom are floating 50 miles away from each other in your mind because they refer to different notions. But they're cheek by jowl as far as your tongue is concerned. And that's what a poem does. Poems match sounds up the way you matched them when you were a tiny kid using that detachable front phoneme. So a phoneme is just a unit of sound. And what I love, this is really speaking to the linguist in me, but there is this way in which all of the different registers on which Paul Chowder is operating, some of them, very sort of erudite and academic, and he's talking about phonemes and scanning and scansion and prosody, but he also, is talking about ZZ Top and, blueberries and all of this very sort of easy, very accessible stuff. So he's giving you this like incredible linguistics, lecture here, but in a way that is so funny and accessible and urgent and really very convincing. Okay, then we have this final point, which I think is really sort of bringing home his argument. He says this: rhyme taught us to talk. So you can imagine that if you are going to write a book about a poet who is pulling together an anthology, you really need to be able to write prose that feels like poetry. And luckily, I mean, really, the only way this book works is because Nicholson Baker's prose is, in fact, so lyrical. Talking about lyrical prose, sometimes that's like actually an insult. Like having lyrical prose can often be like kind of deadly and terrible and, mawkish and sentimental and overwritten and overblown and yucky. Never, never is it like that with Nicholson Baker. In fact, the sort of poetic parts about what he's writing are often subtle and they're often very humorous. But there is this sense of cadence, this sense of words, in fact, feeling very spoken and feeling very like oral in lots of ways that are very important in terms of the poetic nature of his prose. So, right toward the beginning on page 9, we have this. People are going to feed you all kinds of oyster crackers about iambic pentameter. They're going to say, oh, ho, ho, iambic pentameter. So, what's important here is this idea of, oh, ho, ho, iambic pentameter. Because of how he has written it here, you have to pronounce it. Oh ho ho! It's a very specific and like a very evocative way to sort of write down this interjection here, and it is so telling and so perfect in terms of sort of breaking down this elitist argument about iambic pentameter. So the way that he writes it forces the reader to hear it in a certain way that is so beautiful and actually is very hard to do. On page 63, we have another example of this. This is a quotation of Auden. Auden says, about suffering they were never wrong, the eld mesters. He has a pronounced Oxford accent. He has literally written Eldmesters. That is exactly the way that those old crackly recordings of these guys sounds. This Oxford accent, the Eldmesters. It's like it forced me to sort of hear this in a way that made Auden feel both very present and also very past because he in fact sounded so antiquated. It was such genius use, in fact, of letters and of spelling. On page 83, we have another focus on the idea of orality, the idea of hearing someone's voice. So he's talking about W.S. Merwin, who is a poet, and he's talking about how now, this is written around 2009, Merwin is in fact living in Hawaii. Anyway, he does something rare with botany in Hawaii, still sharp as anything. I miss my mom and dad. So many poets are disappointments when you hear them talk on the radio, but Merwin isn't like that. Now, every time I go around this rotary, I think of Merwin's voice on the radio. He's got a wise sensibleness and a gentleness of inflection that makes you want to listen. This is a very sort of complex section, and a lot is happening here. But this idea of this wise sensibleness and this gentle inflection, it's such a beautiful description because, in fact, that is exactly how we hear Paul Chowder's voice. So, this underscoring of voice and the oral and how people are speaking is really important throughout the novel. I also loved this here because, we have a lot of feelings about W.S. Merwin. He's one of the poets who comes up again and again throughout the novel. And we have this idea of him as this like real person who's doing something with botany or pineapples or something in Hawaii. And then as Paul Chowder is thinking about W.S. Merwin, he ends the paragraph, there's a break, and he, not even a space break, he just, after the paragraph, there's a line that stands alone that says, I miss my mom and dad. There, throughout this book, and we aren't going to have time to talk about this in a more full-blown way, there are amazing like non sequiturs that pop out of nowhere, and they are so heartfelt and so well done. Often they're very funny. In this case, I just found it kind of gut-wrenching. He's thinking about W.S. Merwin getting older, living in Hawaii, and then we just have this kind of very clear and in some ways very painful but brief thing about I miss my mom and dad. There's something so incredibly vulnerable about that. It is also underscoring the fact that, Paul Chowder's getting older. He is toward the end of his life. There's no question of whether or not he is going to become a father. There's a hilarious description when he's like, Roz wanted to adopt a child and Paul Chowder doesn't because he's like, I see these terrible kids running around and I worry that I'll be a father of one of them, which I just thought was such a funny and like just like such an adamant and like clear way to be like, no, thank you. But we have this real missing of his mom and dad, and there's this real sense of understanding what he's talking about, and just distilling the sadness into words that are mundane, but so incredibly accessible and so eloquent in lots of ways. And then when we have this beautiful description, the wise sensibleness and gentleness of inflection, we in fact, at least I, and I think we are meant to, we think of Paul Chowder and his wise sensibleness. And sensibleness there has a little bit of, it has an inflection that you could read into it in like a Jane Austen kind of way, like a Sense and Sensibility, because it's both sensible, like Paul Chowder's pretty sensible. He can put in a pine flooring and he knows how lawnmowers work and he's very sensible about many things. But he also is someone who is, feels things very deeply. He is someone who's very sensitive to lots of things. Okay, so these are three different examples of this kind of oral sense that we have, this sense of voices speaking to us, and the ways in which the writing on the page forces us to hear things as if they are spoken. So when we identify something like that in a novel, it's important to take a step back and say, like, so what? So Nicholson Baker, via Paul Chowder, is talking here about the importance of voice, and he's making us kind of hear very immediately some of these voices. So the importance of that, I would argue, is that poetry is all about hearing things. Poetry is about, language being spoken, and it comes from the oral tradition. And there's that great passage in here about how, in fact, a lot of the poems that survived, I think it's like the medieval era, from like Old English or something, that it's only the bad ones that survived because, in fact, the good ones were so catchy and so memorable that you were able to remember them very easily, and only the bad ones had to be written down. Paul Chowder would argue that that is because they rhymed. So there is this emphasis on poetry as meant to be not only spoken, but in fact meant to be sung. We have musical notation throughout here that is like emphasizing and underscoring the musicality and the way we are meant to hear these things, not simply to read them on the page. So the way that he is really emphasizing just an interjection, like, oh, ho, ho, iambic pentameter, like that kind of thing where the reader has to hear it. Like there's no other way to read that on the page. You have to hear it as that kind of like overblown professor. That's the kind of orality that poetry lends itself to and underscores. And I think it's a beautiful study in the orality of poetry and of the novel in general. Another way in which poetry is infused throughout this entire book in a way that just worked so well for me is the use of figurative language. So anyone who's listened to the Fox page for a while knows that figurative language is just language that is doing more than what it is denoting on the page. So, think of metaphor or simile or foreshadowing or symbolism. So, you have him talking about, a plum, and in fact, what he's talking about is mortality, that sort of thing. Nicholson Baker is extremely good at this, and so is Paul Chowder as a result, which is delightful. So the way in a lot of what we have here, there is some symbolism, but a lot of what we are having in terms of figurative language are these comparisons, these analogies. Those are metaphors and similes where, object A or emotion A or experience A is described by comparing it with, emotion B or experience B. So you learn more about A when you have B, but I've said this before, if you are comparing A, emotion A, to like X, it's too far afield, and he doesn't do that. In fact, I think these are artful, but they are unique, and they're sort of interesting enough in many ways. And the book itself is complex enough that they never feel cliched, but they also never feel too sort of random or jarring. So we're going to take a look at just three examples of figurative language, which I think are just excellent. There's so many in the novel, but these are a few that stood out. The first is on page 49. He's talking about rhyming, and he's talking about how essentially this feels like a puzzle in your brain. Its pieces are sort of interlocking in ways that are very primitive and very basic and very satisfying. So he's likening it to a crossword puzzle. So there is our metaphor, that rhyme is the crossword puzzle of literature. And then we have this. It's not a crossword puzzle. It's better than a crossword puzzle because you're actually trying to do something beautiful. But it's not unrelated. The addicts of crossword puzzles are also distracting themselves. They also don't want to face the world's grief head on. They want that transient pleasure, endlessly repeated, of solving the Rubik's Cube of verbal intersection. But has anyone ever wept at the beauty of a crossword puzzle? Maybe, maybe, I have not. So, what we have here is the satisfying nature of language interlocking. But then we have this idea, the interlocking nature of crosswords you can kind of imagine. Then he takes it one step further to the idea of the Rubik's Cube, which I just thought was so funny and inventive and kind of off the wall in a perfect Paul Chowder kind of way. Then he does that beautiful thing with language where he has this question: has anyone wept over a crossword puzzle? And then he says, maybe, comma, maybe. That's that kind of thing that is spoken, and it feels like you're having this chat with Paul Chowder and he's just talking to you instead of writing these things down. But then he goes back to his very his conviction: I have not. And I love the way that that's kind of like this pronouncement, this like heavy thing at the end of the paragraph. Has anyone wept over a crossword puzzle? I have not. Okay, on 110 we have another example of figurative language. They almost read like little poems themselves or little koans or something. But spending your life concentrating on death is like watching a whole movie and thinking only about the credits that are going to roll at the end. It's a mistake of emphasis. I mean, this is so smart and so interesting. It's actually such a good way to think about it. This is a simile because we have like. What he is saying here is, but spending your life concentrating on death is like watching a movie and thinking only about the credits. So I like the idea of drawing this simile, but then also having like an explanation for it. It's a mistake of emphasis. So one of the things that he's been doing throughout the entire novel is helping us understand which syllables to emphasize and how we need to add a rest, a beat at the end of a certain line of poetry, or this idea of which poems he's going to emphasize enough, literally, to put them into the anthology. We don't have enough time to talk about this today, but throughout the novel, there are these facts that he gives us in true Nicholson Baker form. They're always all these kind of abstruse, but really interesting facts. And I loved these. There are actually a couple of them at the bottom of this page that I want to just touch on very briefly. You can take it a step further and say, as Herrick did, gather ye rosebuds. Go ahead, say it if you must, but no, it's a typo. It was supposed to be gather your rosebuds. The YE was an abbreviation for your, but with an E in place of the R. It was corrected to your in the second edition. So part of me was like, oh my God, we've been going around saying like, gather ye rosebuds as ye may. I also say as ye may, which is like, that's like totally wrong. But this idea of gather ye rosebuds, the fact that we've all been wrong about that, I mean, part of me was like, oh shoot, now it's like Nabokov. Like once you know that the correct way to say it is one way, it's sort of hard to not like bring that up and sound super pedantic and annoying to whoever is saying gather ye rosebuds. But I really liked the idea that like a simple, typo, and the fact that he doesn't say typographical error. He's like, it's a simple typo. There's that very casual register together with this kind of very scholarly kind of register. So it's this idea that this was this typographical error. It's meant to be gather your rosebuds. But then he has this nice line about how, in fact, the wrongness of these things are what help them endure. The other example of wrongness is the fact that carpe diem is not seize the day. It is, in fact, kind of pluck the day, like pluck it kind of gently, because of carpe, whatever that means in Latin. Seize the day is very different than pluck the day, pluck the flower of the day. But there is this delight in having these facts. Okay, but back to figurative language. We're going to look at our last example on page 123. This is when he's talking about teaching at Hafner College, and he just like couldn't do it. It was just like the death of him. And in fact, in true Paul Chowder fashion, he like quits in the middle of a semester and just causes all these issues. So this is what he says about teaching. And again, think of figurative language. There was a larger unhappiness too, a darker kind of knowledge that sprouted and blossomed and uncoiled its thorns in me over the semester, which was that I was being paid to lie. He can't be telling them that, in fact, their poems are good when, in fact, their poems are not good. So on some level, you kind of respect his principles, but you're also like, okay, come on, Paul, like see the semester out. Like you gotta get through the semester, which of course he cannot do because he's a total goofball. But I love this idea here. This is a relatively cliche kind of metaphor here. He is saying, another kind of knowledge that sprouted and blossomed and uncoiled its thorns in me over the semester. There are a couple of other times when we see thorns and thorniness that is growing. It's through his yard in one part, but there is a certain metaphorical weight to those things too. Again, you could argue that this is a little bit cliche, but I really like it because it's not about, it's this darkness that is sprouting, and it's not so much about it, the blooms. It's about it's sprouted and it bloomed, but it's the thorns. Uncoiled its thorns in me. So it's inside of him and it's uncoiling this thorniness, which is, I think, a very apt description for how he's realizing that he is in fact lying to these young students. It's so funny to me too. Every time he talks about young people or teenagers or students, he always describes them as sleepy, the sleepy students or the sleepy teenagers, which I just think is so, again, it's so sweet. The word sleepy is so sweet. It's not, they're not angsty and they're not exhausted. There's this kind of sleepy feeling about them. It seems so apt and also such a nice kind of refrain to have that happening over and over. This is just one very last little example of figurative language. There's on page 48, he says, poetry is a controlled refinement of sobbing, which is just such an excellent way to think about it. And again, we have this mixing of registers here, and we have this enormous emotional weight. Poetry is a controlled refinement of sobbing. It's so good. The figurative language in the novel is excellent. So the humor that we see throughout the book is really one of my favorite aspects of this novel. And part of the reason why I love the humor so much is there is so much warmth and so much vulnerability, but it's also unique and interesting. And oftentimes it's phrased in a way that is unique, and feels very much like Paul Chowder, but they're often things that we can really relate to. The other thing that I love is in lots of examples of the humor, it's like there's a whole entire like journey and we're just getting the very end of it, but you can kind of imagine this whole backstory, this whole hilarious like joke that we are just getting the punchline for, and it's so efficient and so incredibly well done. They're not like one-liners, like these are not just like quippy kind of things, and some of them need a little setup, but it was so satisfying to kind of pull them out and realize how well they work even out of context. Here's one. For instance, here's a recent New Yorker. Actually, no, it was published almost 6 years ago. Which I just thought that was so funny because I personally also have my pile of New Yorkers, and you keep thinking you're going to get to them at some point, and you'll grab one at one point and you'll be like, oh my God, wait, this is about Christmas. There's also like a crazy elitism there. It also speaks to the fact that Paul Chowder really like cannot get his shit together. So I really loved all of the different work. Plus, it is, again, it's so spoken. You're like right there with him. Like he's like, for instance, here's a recent New Yorker. Actually, no, it was published almost 6 years ago. That kind of contradicting himself in real time there makes it feel very immediate. Okay, then we have this line. Tim split up with his wife several years ago, and he took up eating, which is so funny. I mean, you might take up a lot of different things, but for Tim to take up eating, several years ago when he broke up with his wife it's so funny to me. Then we have this. This is the poem that he wrote when he was a youngster, when he was in fourth grade, when his teacher told him that they could use blank verse, and even as a fourth grader, he knew that that was guano. But we have this description of the poem, in fact, that he wrote. It was about a droplet of water quivering gracefully at the end of the tap before falling into the land they call disposal. It was a terrible poem, but my mother liked it, and it was remarkably easy to write. And that was the beginning of my career. So one of the things that's so funny about that, not only the land they call disposal, it's funny because he's using the word disposal. There's also later in the novel, he's looking into his sink, and it's this real moment of mindfulness when he's like really asking us, to sort of be paying attention to what is around us and seeing beauty everywhere. He looks in and he sees Incinerator, which is so just classic Nicholson Baker to notice like the brand name and have it be some kind of clever punny thing like that. In fact, he also talks about how one of the reasons we really love puns is because of that very, sort of foundational, very primitive feeling of like words as making a certain amount of sense and belonging, in certain categories and being close to each other, but having very disparate meanings. That's why puns actually function the way they do. So, this idea of disposal here also kind of harkens to this point in the novel when he sees incinerator. So, we have a lot this is doing a lot of work, this one joke here. But one of the things I like best about it is this idea. It was a terrible poem, but my mother liked it, and it was remarkably easy to write. He's not putting too much weight on the fact that his mother likes it. It's like that's like an important reason why his career got going, was because his mom liked his poem. It's just so good how seriously he takes his fourth grade self. It's genius. Okay, then he has this description from when he's teaching the sleepy students at Hafner College. They handed their week's work in, and I lifted the pile of fresh poems in the air to feel its weight. It was unusually heavy because one of the poems was 20 pages long. Like, that is so funny to me. So there's an interesting thing that's happening here too, and I didn't notice until I typed these out into my little thing here. They all handed their week's work in. What I had written first was they all handed in their week's work. Because usually you would have that preposition together with its verb, handed in. But here he's separating it because, in fact, there is this very poetic thing that is happening syntactically. And you're forced as the reader to feel like there's a certain lyrical quality because of this kind of syntax. So again, he says, they all handed their week's work in. I mean, that literally sounds like, like fear not the heat of the sun, or like some sort of Shakespearean thing. They all handed their week's work in. And then I lifted the pile of fresh poems in the air. I mean, that's kind of a Lion King thing, but the pile of fresh poems is so good. Like, you can feel the way that the pile would feel, but also fresh poems is so funny. And then, of course, he wants to feel its weight, which is speaking also to like the weight of poetry, like the metaphorical importance of poetry. But then this idea of it being unusually heavy because one of the poems was 20 pages long, it's kind of like his mom liking the poem. He's just delivering that information. He's not elaborating on it, but in fact, it's hilarious that one of his sleepy students is turning in a 20-page long poem that he then is going to have to lie about. It's so genius. Then we have this final example. I found a pen and turned to the back of Mary Oliver's book of poems, and I wrote, People I'm Jealous of. I wrote James Fenton, Sinead O'Connor, Lawrence Hart, John Stewart, Billy Collins. Billy Collins, indeed, charming, chirping crack whore that he is. No, that's incorrect. I know nothing about him. So I have to admit that the only poet that I have really read any work of for a long, long time is, in fact, Billy Collins. In fact, when we were in the car, when my kids were younger, I used to put on the like CD of Billy Collins poetry and make them listen to it. Like, I would just pop it in every once in a while, and they'd be like, "Oh my God!" But meaning they weren't that happy. They would rather listen to music than listen to Billy Collins, which, I mean, fair. But I wanted them to have some exposure, and I loved that work. And I think I loved it because it's so appealing and it's so approachable, and it's just absolutely beautiful. But at one point, Paul Chowder is talking about Billy Collins being, Mr. Big Seller or Mr. Bestseller. So there's this idea of real jealousy and resentment of Billy Collins that I thought was so genius. I also think it's so funny, John Stewart being on this list. That's one of those examples of like a whole entire universe behind this. He has not talked about Jon Stewart. We don't know how he feels about snarky kind of news shows in the evening. But we have this whole kind of idea of the ways in which he would be jealous of someone like Jon Stewart. Sinead O'Connor actually comes up a couple of times, and he's extolling the beauty of this song that she sings. So the fact that he later then says he's jealous of her is so, so good. I love everything about this, but again, it's also doing some very important work and including these whole kind of universes in itself. In addition to this kind of more straightforward humor, there are these interludes that I found so incredibly appealing and so inventive throughout the novel. And these are interludes when Paul Chowder is essentially bringing back some very important poet from the dead. So suddenly we have these poets kind of showing up in these mundane and really appealing contexts with Paul Chowder, clearly in Paul Chowder's imagination. But on page 20, for example, we have the first of these, and it comes as a real surprise, but it is so appealing. One time I remember I was in a laundromat. It was a laundromat in Marseille, France. Marseille. Do you hear that? It's a mattress of a word with lots of spring to it. Marseille. I was in there doing my laundry and I look over and there's this guy there, this little guy. He was kind of pale, pasty looking, but moving with a methodical grace. And I said, Ed? And he looked up slowly. He nodded cavernously. I said, Ed Poe? And he said, mm-hmm. And then he peered closely at me. He said, Paul? Paul Chowder? And I said, yes, Ed, how are you doing? Been a long time. He nodded. I said, I see you're folding some underpants there. I thought this was so funny. So I love the fact that he's calling him Ed. It's clearly Edgar Allan Poe, which I didn't know that he spent a lot of time in Marseille in France, but apparently he did. So they're on this first name basis. And the fact that Ed is going to be like Paul Chowder. And these are other examples of how like spoken interactions are captured so well on the page. This idea of Ed as saying like, mm-hmm, like you know exactly what that sounds like. But the idea of he nodded cavernously. I mean, that is the perfect way to describe Edgar Allan Poe. It's just absolute genius. And then this very kind of mundane, but like absolutely mystical and incredible interaction ends with this idea, I see you're folding some underpants there. It's so good. We're going to talk about the sort of heft of this in a second, but I want to look at a couple more examples of how he is having these interactions with these poets. So the next one is on page 77. It's nighttime and he is at his barn and he's sitting on his white plastic chair at night. Then in the mist, I saw a big man walking up the street. He was wearing one shoe. He had a familiar look, so I got out of my chair and went part way down the driveway and I waved at him. It's not usual, really, for people to walk up and down my street without two shoes on at midnight. So funny. I mean, it's not really usual for anybody to walk up and down the street, with only one shoe on at midnight. He stopped. He put his hand on the telephone pole that's there. He looked down, and then he looked over at me. He was a big guy, big, strong, bald head, wide nose, kind of a defiant, wild, defeated look. I said, Ted? Ted Rethke, is that you? And he nodded slightly. I said, wow, Ted, how's it going? You look like you just got hit with a couple 100 million volts of electricity. No, it's hydrotherapy, he said. I do not laugh. I do not cry. I'm sweating out the will to die. Whoa, Ted, I said, sounds a little like Dr. Seuss, except dark. You want to come in and maybe make a phone call to a loved one? He shook his head no. I found this so funny. The description of it and just like the drama and it's actually kind of mellow drama here is so excellent. It's like how you would imagine these poets, these kind of larger than life and like these, suicidal depressives. Sorry, that was like very offhanded the way I said that. But this description, he put his hand on the telephone pole that's there. He looked down and then he looked over at me. It's so, so good. And then the best part to my mind is this idea after Ted says, I do not laugh, I do not cry, I'm sweating out the will to die. We have our Paul Chowder say, sounds a little like Dr. Seuss, except dark, which is so good because it really does sound like Dr. Seuss. And in fact, Paul has extolled the virtues of Dr. Seuss because of all the rhyming and how genius it all is. But this idea of I do not laugh, I do not cry, I'm sweating out the will to die is absolutely Seussian. It's so well done. Okay, we have another example here. Tennyson's at the salad bar, making his way around, holding the chilled plastic plate, fumbling in his beard. Poet laureate of the British Empire. Staring for a long time at the tub of bean salad. Pope's there, Alexander Pope, the magpie trickster rock polisher, malevolently ladling the blue cheese at eye level. Hey, Alex, you don't want to talk to me? That's fine. So here we have Tennyson and Alexander Pope both at the salad bar, and at this point they are not, in fact, wanting to engage. I love the idea of ladling the blue cheese malevolently. I mean, there is something kind of malevolent about blue cheese that is perfect and apt and just like so good. So there is one final example of this that I found so moving and so sweet. It's at the very end of the novel, and it's very subtle. So unless you were really paying attention, unless you've read this book many times like I have, you might have missed it. So at the end, we have our Paul Chowder. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but he's out taking a hike. And we have talked quite a bit before about Swinburne, and there's a lot of stuff about Swinburne throughout the novel. And then we have this toward the end. I saw a little red-haired man in a velvet jacket carrying Charles Simick's poems, the edition with the beautifully empty paper bag on it. I said, Algernon? He shook his head. I said, oh, sorry. So here, Algernon, this person who he thinks is Algernon Swinburne, a red-haired man in a velvet jacket, is it's like you should be clued in fact, that the velvet jacket would be something worn by a poet. And then he has this beautiful thing where he's like, Algernon? And he's incorrect. He's sort of mistaking some random person for Algernon Swinburne. But it's this beautiful extra little bonus here where we're getting toward the end of the novel, so you could read this sadly as like this thing that he's not, in fact, going to be able to conjure up these poets anymore because he's either getting toward the end of the anthology because he's going to write it or because he's not going to write it. I'm not going to spoil it for you. But I just loved this last edition of this example of him being able to sort of conjure these people. So again, what is the importance? What is like the so what of this? Like why do we have these like very entertaining and sweet interludes with these poets? I think largely what he is trying to do here is to bring these poets to life and make them feel relevant and make them feel present and make them feel like real people, partly because he is in fact wanting to sort of have some sort of bid for mortality, for immortality himself, but also just the notion of making us as readers think about poetry and think about poets. It's just beautiful. Also, to sort of meld these poets who are no longer living into the present day of the novel is just beautiful. It's like a way of almost sort of resurrecting them in the same way that he is resurrecting a lot of poetry by people we do know and people we don't know. It's so beautifully done. I want to close today with something that's a little unusual. So one of the things that I found myself doing throughout this novel that is not normal for me is I kept making these little hearts in the margins. And it would come at times when I would be so moved by something that he was writing and so sort of touched by it that I wasn't going to just do my normal like asterisks or my normal exclamation marks or my ha that I write when something is funny. So I want to go through very briefly and look at these sections. They're just usually one line where I've written a little heart next to them. And I'm not going to give a lot of analysis of these parts. I'm hoping they're going to stand on their own. And also, if you are reading the book or you plan to go back and read it or reread it, these are things that you will have a sense of their importance. But also, I think just reading them out loud is there's reason enough for that, just to feel their beauty. Roz stopped and said hello to Smacko and picked up something in the sand. I heard her bracelets jingle, a sound I hadn't heard in a while. Here's a present from the driveway, she said, and handed it to me. It was a fragment of old china with very fine rule lines in blue against white. Bits of old china sometimes appear in the driveway as rains wash more of its sand away. I took off my glasses to look at it and thanked her. Then I offered her a chip. I love this. I love the idea of the china washing up, and I love the idea of him then thanking her with a chip. So the very last of these little hearted sections that we're going to look at is toward the very end of the novel, and this is when Paul is speaking with a group of people, and he's there as sort of an authority, like an authoritative poet figure, and someone asks him a question. And I found this part so moving because, in fact, it surprises Paul Chowder a little, so it also thereby surprises the reader. But there is also this sense of this advice that he is giving as very relevant to any sort of person who's trying to write poetry. But it's also a beautiful note for us to end on, and it's also a beautiful example of advice for life. Okay, so here we go. A man of about 40 or so, with a French accent, asked, "How do you achieve the presence of mind to initiate the writing of a poem?" And something cracked open in me, and I finally stopped hoarding and told them my most useful secret, the only secret that has helped me consistently over all the years that I've written. I said, "Well, I'll tell you how. I ask a simple question. I ask myself, what was the very best moment of your day?" The wonder of it was, I told them, that this one question could lift out from my life exactly what I will want to write a poem about. Something I hadn't even known was important will leap up and hover there in front of me saying, I am the best moment of the day. It's so beautiful. So this is that kind of mindfulness that I think Nicholson Baker, with his attention to language and to detail and to moments and to surroundings and to mechanics of things, all of that is an invitation, I think, for us to really, engage in the moment and to look for beauty in the mundane and look for beauty in language and to read more poetry, frankly. So I am going to leave you with that, with this question. I mean, it's a very simple, like, gratitude thing. What is the best moment of my day? Anyone out there who's trying to write, I mean, go ahead, knock yourselves out, sit down, think of the best time of your day and write a poem about it. So thank you so much for tuning in and for sticking with me in this deep dive into Nicholson Baker's The Anthologist. I just love this book so much, and I'm so happy to finally have a really good excuse to dig into all the ways that it's amazing. So thanks for tuning in. Happy reading.